I'm here to talk about kind of ecosystem services, the areas around your farm that are not necessarily the ones that you manage as intensively as your cropland, but some of the areas that I think are probably helping you out on your operation. So this is a picture of my farm. I was lucky enough to have a friend that wanted to go and fly around last spring. This was just after seeding time. And I guess when I don't know that I thought of it at the time, but when I look at it now, it's hard not to notice a dichotomy that's happening where I've got some nice, very straight lines, you notice, and over here is, this is where I farm, and over here is this other area that I own, and we have conservation easement on this particular one. But really, it's not all that involved in the farming operation. We don't graze there. We don't do anything with the woodlands. The top of the picture is a creek that runs across. We don't water out of it. It's just there, and I guess it got me thinking a little bit. Alex did a good job, I think, of talking about kind of what the goals were of their farm, or goals are. And for me, I think improving soils and improving carbon is the big thing there. Ben spoke earlier about what 1% more organic matter in your soil can do for you in terms of being able to deal with either excess moisture or not enough moisture. And improving resiliency on your soils through that. And so that's, I think, kind of number one for me, because I think that translates to being able to make money farming down the road. We farm a section now, and I don't think I'm ever going to be able to afford to buy more, so I should manage what I have well, and maybe we'll be able to make that work on one section. So that last picture was June 1st, 2019. This is June 7th, 2019. The other thing I wanted to say here, you see all that black dirt that I'm not supposed to have, but you usually do. And so don't feel like I know all the answers, because I don't by any stretch of the imagination. I try to reduce tillage. I try to do less, but when I do till, I think I till fairly intensively, and so yeah, I make mistakes here. So this picture I took on June the 8th of last year. So we got something growing on that black field. And I was doing some fencing. We custom grazed some animals last year for a neighbor and a guy that I'd say has become a friend since. And I'm trying to divide those areas even further. That isolation strip and then the mowed strip wasn't enough. Now I'm putting up a fence to separate my cropland from the forested land, because that wasn't enough separation for me, and now that I think about it in hindsight. So we've heard this story. When I was asked to speak, I didn't know I was going to be following the entomologist who's told you most of this stuff. But so this is what we're going to summarize some of what he said again. That graph, or I like charts and graphs. A lot of people don't, but you're going to see some here. The one on the left is showing, the top one shows and I'm going to have to remember this, right? It's the abundance of pollinators as you travel away from a wetland. And so the top line is in a cereal crop, the bottom line is in a canola crop, and the dotted line is in a native pasture type situation. So as you move away from those natural lands, you see less and less pollinators, and the bottom left is the same idea of moving away from a wetland. We're seeing less variety of different, or less, fewer different species, with the exception of in the grassland, you see that there's more species as you go away from what they were looking at. We talk a lot about pollinators, and we hear that they're a good thing, but it's hard to say exactly how much they're doing for you a lot of the time, and I like this chart on the right for that reason. This is measuring bee abundance and yield of open pollinated canola. And so those of us that grow some mustard, I think you could pretty much take these numbers and use them to guide what it does, or what native bees do for as a pollination service. The top right corner of that graph would be 100% pollination. And in this study, 100% pollination meant there were on average 25 seeds in each pod of open pollinated canola. And if you were to take where I think the average of all those dots is in terms of bee abundance is probably somewhere, I'm going to use my thing since I've got it, but it's somewhere over here. And so that translates to you lose maybe 7 or 8 pods, or 7 or 8 seeds per pod, which is then 30% of your yield you've lost because we don't have good pollination. And that was the only difference in that study. Everything else was good. You had fertility, you had everything, you had moisture, but you didn't have good pollination, and so you lost this huge chunk of yield. And so what I think that means is that we need to make a home for some of those species. And so I participated in this. Syngenta did this Operation Pollinator program. General Mills had a similar program this past year, and it was run through the conservation districts that where you could apply. And I think if for those interested, you can still apply, and I'll show you a slide at the end about that. But I like this picture because they helped to pay for some seed in this little 7-acre field that's on the corner of that view from the plane that I showed earlier. But in the foreground, you see that's goldenrod is what's flowering in the ditch. In the back there is that riparian area that was in the top of that photo. And so there's what John was talking about a little bit in there. You need to have something flowering throughout the whole season so that you've got a home, or you've got food for those bugs, so they can stick around and do some good for you. And so I like this picture for that reason. John mentioned shelter belts. This is one that we planted in 2014-15. So the stuff on the left we planted in 14-15 on the right. And the charts below talk about the yield response of growing a crop in close proximity to a shelter belt. So the chart, or the graph on the bottom right, shows you kind of how that yield, it is, you lose yield immediately adjacent to the shelter belt, usually due to lack of moisture. But over the area that shelter belt is effective, ultimately you have more yield. The crop on, if you look at the table there, in a wheat crop, we see an average increase of 8% more wheat for the area that the shelter belt is effective. And this study found that it's about 25 times the height of the tree. So if you're planning to put shelter belt rows across a field, that's kind of what you have to think about, I think, is that how far between the rows should be maybe 25 times the height of the trees. And so this is the graph for wheat, which shows that kind of bump where you get 20% more maybe is the peak, and then it kind of tapers off as you move away. With some of the other crops in the study, you see much bigger yields, but I think wheat's a good one to use because it's one of the lower ones. I think wheat and oats don't respond that well because they've been bred to deal with low moisture environments, and so they don't really see that huge bump that some other things do. This is that same shelter belt this past fall, so it's come a long way. It's now a 5-row multi-species. There's about 20 species in there, and the tall trees are getting to be 15 to 20 feet tall kind of thing now. But as you see, when you're standing in there, there's lots of stuff. There's food for bugs, birds, and all sorts of wildlife, and they kind of use it as a corridor now. Usually the deer used to walk across that field, and now they make their way into there and walk along, so they stay out of the wind all winter, and I think they're doing better because of it. Shelter belts do a great job of spreading out the snow that used to end up in the bush and along the edge of our bush is not finding its way there as much anymore. We're able to spread it over the area, the field area, a lot better. And so I find there's a few of these things we can do in managing those areas and maintaining a lot of those natural areas on the edges of our field that we feel like, and I think we've all learned this or we've taught this, and those of you that are older and smarter than me have figured this out already, but those areas play a big role in the productivity of the areas that we're counting on to be productive all the time. And so if we can kind of emulate what's going on in the forested areas and what's going on in that riparian area and bring that into our cropping systems, I think there's some significant gains to be made. And there are some costs certainly in it, but I guess this maybe turns back to the fact that I said I've got my section and I don't know that I'm going to buy any more land. So this is a way to make those acres pay a little bit better for me. John talked about beetle banks. I thought I was going to be the only guy or the only person that talked about a dung beetle, and I'm the third person, and we're only on the first day. Beetle bank there, and John kind of described it a little bit, but in the bottom left corner, you can see this came out of, it was a European design, but they're a little bit smaller than what he was talking about, and for me, I think that works a little bit easier. So they're 2 meters wide, and you make them about a foot high, just a little ridge, I guess, across the field. The picture on the right is, I worked with the university this year in their pollinator strip program, and I think Michael talked about it a little bit earlier this morning. But it was a mix that they came up with Xerxes, and that bisected the field that was closest to us in that aerial picture. This strip ran right up the middle of it with, got peas and oats on either side, and it's about a 15-meter wide strip of a bunch of flowering species. And I think I should have included a beetle bank in there while I was doing it, just to create a little bit more diversity there. It's kind of targeted towards pollinators, but I think in organic cropping systems, we could use a lot of the services that the beetles can provide, and I'm sure they're there, but if I could make them a home, I think I'd probably see a little more abundance as well. I was going to tell you what that bug on the top left is eating, but I don't want John to correct me, so he's eating something bad. So I think this all shifts me to start to think we see the value of the services that are being provided through the forested areas and through the riparian areas, and now we're creating habitat in our cropped areas through shelter belts and through these beetle banks and pollinator strips and things like that. And so I think the natural progression is to try and have that on every square foot of the land, and so we're using livestock to do what the guys on the panel were talking about this morning, and that's try and integrate more of these regenerative principles into our production system. And so we've included perennials in our rotation. We're trying to, this is a field of oats and annual clover that we grazed. On the left and on the right, it's a field of oats that's underseeded to alfalfa, clover, timothy mix that'll be grazed in the next couple of years. But I think we see the value, and we talk about bugs a lot, and I think Alex mentioned a few things about noticing the presence of fungi and some of the other soil microorganisms that we don't see as easily, and I think we don't think about as much, but probably deserve a whole bunch more attention than we give to them. And sorry, John, but maybe even more than we think about the bugs. If we thought about what was going on under the soil, I think there's lots of gains to be made there. And so that's shaping a lot of the rotation and the kind of considerations that we're, I think I just double skipped, that we have. And so we are we've got about a 5 crop or so rotation that we're only taking a cash crop 2 or maybe 3 years in that rotation, and there's a couple of years of pasture, and it's just helping us to improve those soils, break up all the cycles, so that I don't need to use any too many products, I guess, that to fight with pests that we're seeing in our systems. Because I think that, and John said this already, but I'd like to say it again, that if you have that diversity in your whole system, I think you see fewer of the problems of spikes in individual pest species. So if we've got those checks in place, I don't think anything kind of gets out of control. And I'm still young, and I'm going to learn that the hard way, that I'm wrong at some point. But I think when you look over time, I'd like to think that makes sense, and I think we'll be okay if we can kind of manage those systems. So yeah, that's that. So just in summary, yeah, some of those natural areas, I think they help. They can increase production, certainly. Create resilience in cropping systems through managing those extremes. So all these big fluxes in insect pest cycles, likely disease cycles as well. I think having that diversity is resiliency in your system, and so I think it's important to use that. When I go back to that fencing project that I did, I probably should have run my perimeter fence on the perimeter of the piece instead of running it inside of the forested areas, so that I can use those areas at times if I need to graze in them. But I think there's value in using them for a lot of those reasons. All the studies say having trees around us makes us happier and healthier and everything else, through the beautification and all the other things that they do for us. Wildlife habitat's definitely a big thing. That's I work for Manitoba Habitat, and a lot of our funders give us money to provide either breeding habitat or whatever it is, or critical habitat, I guess, for any individual species. And so I think there's enough of that in our area, and I think it's something that we can usually use more of. Some organizations to contact if you're interested in doing these sort of projects. The conservation districts have traditionally been a good place to go for funding with shelter belts. I think moving forward, they're going to continue to have money. MHHC, the group that I work with, has got about $150 million in the last year, and we're to be spending the interest on that on an annual basis. And a lot of that money is being funneled into conservation districts for projects like habitat preservation. Ourselves and ducks, if you're on the west part of the province, have lots of money to either preserve or restore wetlands. Actually, it doesn't matter where you are in the province almost. If you want to restore wetlands, there's groups that'll help you do that. These pollinator strips and beetle banks, talk to your CD, the university. General Mills and Xerxes they have lots of knowledge around different things you can do to encourage insects, beneficial insects, and you can read for days on that. Conservation districts have a program to help you protect riparian areas, and hopefully you can find ways to use some of these organizations to extract some income to help you to make this make sense. But I think in the long run, most of those areas more than pay for themselves. This integrating cover crops and livestock, I think, and the other guys this morning talked about it. I just think that that's a invaluable tool into trying to make some of these systems work and be able to see value in some of the areas that maybe aren't very well suited for annual crop production. The province has got some funding through Ag Action to help out with some of those things. And I think if you look around and you're interested in using livestock more in your annual cropping systems, you can find money fairly easily to help with watering systems and some fencing projects and things like that. So I'd encourage you to ask around or come talk to one of us that deals with some of those things if you've got questions. But otherwise, that's all I've got for you. I was supposed to be a 20-minute, not a 40-minute, but so I'll be 20 and we'll have 20 for questions. So the questions around tile drainage and how it might affect natural areas that we should be thinking about protecting. That's a tough question. Tile drainage is a tool that I think has a place. I think we're maybe being a little bit liberal with it, definitely in this province. It's a tough one. Like it really can impact the hydrology in a pretty big area, and it's a tool that's designed to manage water tables essentially. And so I think it's something that we're maybe not understanding very well, and we're giving out a lot of licenses to use. So yeah, I don't know. It's something maybe we don't understand all that well, and we're doing a lot of, in my mind, but I don't know.
Another question or a comment? Yes, please.
You're not doing anything wrong. You are exactly what that graph showed. So the question was around yield loss immediately adjacent to trees or shelter belts or things of that nature. So if we looked at that again, you'd see it's pretty much zero yield until you get about 1 or 1.5 times away from the height of the trees. So your 60 feet makes perfect sense, I think. And you should see 120% yield on your wheat field according to their research. That was, John Court did that work out of Indian Head. If you were 5 times the height of the trees away from the trees, then you get that big bump and it kind of tapers off over time. But yeah, the first 2 times the height, so if your trees are 30 feet tall, you're bang on, you pretty much lose yield there. So I would say that's you want to plant some grass or something there, and hopefully see some value in it. There's a little slider on there.
Any fields that I've had where the trees are around them and it's a smaller field, the yields are through the roof. I just can't. And it's just an observation. It's not anything studied or that. But I think that trees make a big difference. They make like a microclimate or something. I don't know what they do, but it's just a comment I have to that.
Yes, to answer your question in the back there, overall the yield in that field will be better because the bluff is there. But right beside the trees, you're right, there's not much yield. Not according to Scott. Okay, something else. Yes.
Do you see that effect on both sides of a shelter belt or just on the downwind of a prevailing wind?
You're probably, you should see more on the leeward side, especially in your case where you're limited by moisture on a regular basis. I would think you'd see it spread, but so hopefully if you go 20 times the height of those trees and put your next row there, then I guess it gives you some on the upwind side too.
Okay.
Actually, on that score, I have multi-layered sort of question on shelter belts. So about a decade ago, one of our beloved federal governments took down PFRA and devolved it into something else. Can you say what's taken its place a little bit more? I think you hinted at that. And secondly, can you expand on that last point you made about diversity of shelter belts? My dad loved straight willow trees. Is there a better way of doing that? And then I think thirdly is how do you create a shelter belt nowadays when there's so much chemical drift? And if it's just organic farm upon organic farm, it's possible. But like, what's the politics or like, I don't know, the practical solution to those shelter belts just sort of bolting up in short order from chemicals?
I can take a stab at that. I don't have all the answers. I don't think anything has really replaced what PFRA had at Indian Head, and I don't know that that'll ever happen. Through my work, I was tasked with planting a 20-kilometer shelter belt along number 1 highway, kind of between Eli and Oakville, in an area that the highway is often closed, and there's a couple of big new developments that don't want to see that highway closed, period. And so the design that was proposed by the province was that we should plant white spruce every 20 feet, and because they're kind of slow, we'll start with a 20-foot tall white spruce, and then it'll speed things along, and that cost about $1,000 a tree to do in Centerport area. They just did about a mile of that. And so I propose that we follow that kind of same design that I showed you, that shelter belt that I had planted. And it's what Alex talked about. It's 5 rows with a lot of diversity in there. So there's everything from prairie rose up to oak trees, and depending on what your soil is. So the shelter belt that we're planting by Eli is suited to an area that's pretty heavy soils. It can deal with a little bit of salinity, because there is some of that along that highway ditch. And I think that diversity is the key to managing your concerns about the chemical drift and other things, because that's been why that old shelter belt died, was just consistent exposure to chemical that never really killed it, I think, but just kept it in a weakened state throughout its whole life. And so we've picked some variety or some species that are better able to deal with chemical drift. But it's things like getting away from that single row, single species, because if not, if that was a good idea, all the guys that planted a row of green ash 20 years ago would look pretty smart, because I like green ash trees, but now they're all going to die in the next 10 years because the emerald ash borer is going to kill them. And so I just think you can't put all your eggs in one basket like that. So yeah, I don't know if I answered all your questions.